The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there, refusing to let go. Clara huddled deeper into her coat as she hurried down the cracked concrete steps leading to the train platform. The dim, flickering fluorescent lights overhead did little to illuminate the space, casting long, eerie shadows across the graffiti-streaked walls. The air smelled of damp concrete, old metal, and the faint tang of urine. It was Chicago at night, dangerous, restless, and alive in the worst way. Clara was 22, a junior majoring in sociology at a university downtown. She had just come from a grueling day of back-to-back classes and a late-night shift at a coffee shop, the exhaustion written in the slump of her shoulders. Her backpack felt like a lead weight pressing against her back, and her legs ached from standing all day. All she wanted was to get home, curl up in her tiny apartment, and sleep until the sun greeted the city's skyline again. The train station was nearly deserted, save for a few sketchy figures lingering near the far end of the platform. Clara kept her head down, pretending not to notice them. She had learned to stay invisible in places like this. A young black woman traveling alone at night couldn't afford to draw attention to herself. Not here. Not now. She adjusted her headphones, letting the soft hum of music drown out the unsettling creaks and groans of the station. When the train finally screeched to a halt, Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. The doors slid open with a hiss, and she stepped inside, finding a spot near the middle of the car. The train was crowded for this time of night, filled with an odd mix of people: tired workers heading home, a group of rowdy teenagers, and a few solitary figures staring blankly out of dirty windows. Clara slipped into an empty seat, rested her head against the cold window, and closed her eyes. She tried to relax, but the city never let her. Even through her music, she could hear the faint sounds of the outside world: the distant wail of a police siren, the rhythmic clatter of the train on its tracks, the occasional cough or murmur from a fellow passenger. It was a symphony of unease, a constant reminder that danger was never far away. Clara opened her eyes and glanced around the car. Her gaze swept over the passengers, her tired mind barely registering their faces. But then something, or someone, caught her attention. A young woman, no older than Clara herself, sat stiffly a few seats away. Her posture was unnaturally rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Next to her sat an older man, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He was leaning in close, whispering something to the young woman, his hand resting possessively on her arm. Clara frowned, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. There was something off about the scene, something that made her stomach churn with unease. The young woman's face was pale, her eyes wide and darting around the car as if searching for an escape. She looked like she wanted to scream but didn't dare make a sound. Clara's pulse quickened. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but her instincts told her something was very, very wrong. She looked away, trying to shake the feeling, but her eyes kept drifting back to the pair. It was like watching a car crash. You didn't want to see it, but you couldn't look away. A shiver ran down Clara's spine, and she tightened her grip on her backpack. Something about the man's posture, his grip on the young woman's arm, the way he whispered so intently, it all screamed danger. And then, just as Clara was about to convince herself she was imagining things, the young woman did something that made her breath catch in her throat. She raised her hand, ever so subtly, and made a gesture. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Clara saw it. A small hand signal, a cry for help. Clara's heart started to pound in her chest as she replayed the brief gesture she'd seen. The young woman's hand had moved so subtly, so cautiously, that anyone not paying attention would have missed it entirely. But Clara had seen it. She knew what it was. A distress signal. She'd read about it online. A hand gesture designed to silently communicate that someone was in danger. Palm up, fingers curled into the thumb, then briefly closed into a fist. Help me. Clara's pulse raced as she cast another glance at the pair. The man was still leaning toward the woman, his lips moving as he whispered something Clara couldn't hear. His grip on her arm had tightened, his knuckles white against her pale skin. The woman's eyes flicked toward Clara for the briefest of moments, wide and imploring, before darting back to the floor. Was this really happening? Clara's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and doubts. She looked around the train car, searching for someone, anyone, who might have noticed what she had, but the other passengers seemed oblivious, absorbed in their own worlds. A man in a suit stared blankly at his phone, A teenager with headphones bopped his head to whatever song he was listening to. A mother cradling her sleeping toddler was nodding off herself. No one else was paying attention. Clara swallowed hard and tried to think. What was she supposed to do? She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the urgency of the situation clawing at her chest. She didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to assume the worst, and end up embarrassing herself, or worse, putting herself in danger. But what if she was right? What if that woman really was in trouble? Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, her mind racing through the possibilities. Calling attention to the pair could escalate the situation. The man looked strong, and he didn't seem like the type to back down easily. If he felt cornered, he might lash out. Clara glanced at the emergency number on her phone's screen, her thumb hovering over the call button. She hesitated. Her fear whispered to her, warning her to stay silent, to mind her own business. She was just a tired college student trying to get home. What could she possibly do? But then she thought about the young woman. She thought about the fear in her eyes, the silent plea in her gesture. Clara knew what it felt like to be ignored when you needed help the most. She took a deep breath and began typing a message to 911, her fingers shaking with adrenaline. She described the situation as concisely as she could. I'm on the westbound train, car 5. A young woman is sitting with an older man. She just signaled for help. It might be an abduction. Clara hit send and prayed that help would arrive in time. She tucked her phone back into her pocket, her mind spinning. The train rumbled on, the sound of the wheels clattering against the tracks filling the silence in her head. She tried to focus, tried to formulate a plan. She couldn't just sit there and hope the authorities would get to them before the man did something drastic. Her eyes flicked back to the pair. The young woman was still sitting stiffly, her hands shaking in her lap. The man, meanwhile, seemed to grow more agitated with every passing moment. He leaned in closer, his voice rising just enough for Clara to catch fragments of what he was saying. Don't make a scene. You'll regret it. Just do what I say. Clara's stomach turned. She wanted to look away, wanted to pretend she hadn't heard those words, but she couldn't. Her hands balled into fists in her lap as she tried to suppress the wave of anger bubbling up inside her. How could someone do this? How could he sit there in plain sight and act like he owned her? The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes pulling Clara out of her thoughts. She glanced at the map above the door and realized they were approaching one of the most dangerous stations on the route, the kind of station where the cameras didn't work, the lights barely functioned, and crimes went unnoticed. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The man was getting ready to take her. The train slowed to a crawl, the screeching brakes echoing off the grimy walls of the tunnel as they neared the station. Clara stared at the map above the doors again, her eyes locking onto the name of the upcoming stop. She knew this station. Everyone did. It was infamous for its dim lighting, broken security cameras, and the kinds of people who lurked in its shadows. If that man managed to get the young woman off the train here, anything could happen, and no one would be there to stop him. Her chest tightened as the realization hit her like a freight train. She didn't have time to wait for help to arrive. The authorities would be too late if they weren't already on the way. If she didn't do something now, that woman would vanish into the night, swallowed whole by the city's underbelly. The thought made Clara's stomach churn. But what could she do? Clara wasn't a hero. She wasn't particularly strong or brave. She was just a student with a backpack full of textbooks and a phone that felt like her only lifeline. Her hands trembled as she fidgeted with the straps of her bag, her mind racing through 100 different scenarios. Most of them ended badly. For her, for the young woman, for everyone. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt unbearable. Clara's gaze shifted back to the man and the young woman. His grip on her arm was like a vice, his fingers digging into her flesh as he muttered something under his breath. The young woman flinched but didn't move, her body rigid with fear. Clara's heart ached for her. She could practically feel the terror radiating off the woman, the silent desperation in her wide, darting eyes. Clara had been afraid before, alone in the dark streets of Chicago, catcalled by strangers, followed by shadows that lingered too long. But this was different. This was a fear she couldn't ignore, a fear that demanded action. Her mind flashed back to a self-defense workshop she'd attended on campus a few months ago. The instructor had emphasized the importance of situational awareness, of recognizing danger before it escalated. They'd talked about de-escalation techniques, about how to create distractions and buy time. Clara wished she'd paid more attention, wished she'd taken it more seriously. But there was one piece of advice that stuck with her, a mantra that played on repeat in her head now. Do something. Anything is better than nothing. Clara took a deep breath, her fingers curling into fists as she forced herself to focus. Her fear was still there, a gnawing pit in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. She didn't have the luxury of being scared right now. She had to act. Her eyes darted around the train car, searching for anything she could use. Her gaze landed on the young woman's bag, a small, worn-out purse sitting on the seat beside her. An idea began to form in Clara's mind, a plan that was risky and impulsive but might just work. She adjusted her backpack, shifting it onto one shoulder as she prepared to stand. Clara's legs felt like jelly as she rose from her seat, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the entire train could hear it. She forced herself to take a step forward, then another until she was standing just a few feet away from the pair. The man's eyes flicked toward her, cold and calculating, and Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. But she didn't falter. She couldn't. "Hey," Clara said, her voice louder than she expected. She forced a smile, trying to sound casual despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I think you forgot your bag." The young woman's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto Clara's. For a moment there was only confusion, but then recognition dawned and Clara saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. It was enough to keep her going. Clara reached down, grabbing the purse from the seat. She held it out to the young woman, stepping closer as if she were simply returning a misplaced item. The man's grip on the woman's arm tightened, his jaw clenching as he glared at Clara. "She didn't forget anything," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "Mind your business." Clara's stomach churned, but she didn't back down. She met his glare with as much confidence as she could muster, her hand still extended toward the young woman. "She told me earlier she left something in her bag," Clara lied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Didn't you?" she added, directing the question to the young woman. The woman hesitated for a moment, her gaze darting between Clara and the man. Then slowly she nodded. Yeah, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I need my bag." Clara took another step forward, positioning herself between the man and the young woman. Her heart was racing, her palms slick with sweat, but she didn't let it show. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a terrifying moment, Clara thought he might lash out. But then something shifted. His grip loosened just enough for the young woman to pull her arm free, and Clara seized the opportunity. She grabbed the woman's hand, pulling her toward the center of the car. At that exact moment, the train doors slid open with a hiss, and Clara's heart sank. They'd arrived at the station. The station. The man moved to follow them, his expression dark and furious. But before he could take another step, a voice rang out from the far end of the car. "Police, don't move!" Clara whipped her head around to see two uniformed officers and a pair of security guards storming into the car. Relief washed over her like a tidal wave as the man froze, his hands raised defensively. The officers moved quickly, pinning him against the wall as they barked orders. The young woman clung to Clara's arm, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. "It's okay," Clara murmured, her voice soft and soothing. "You're safe now." The train car erupted into chaos as the officers stormed in, their commands loud and authoritative. Clara stood frozen in place, her breath trembling as she held the young woman, Marina, she later learned, close to her side. The man, who had been so confident and domineering just moments ago, now looked like a cornered animal. His eyes darted around the car, scanning for an escape route as the officers closed in. "I said, don't move," barked one of the officers, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. The man didn't seem to care. He lunged toward the nearest door, his movements desperate and erratic. For a split second, Clara thought he might actually get away. But the officers were faster. One of them blocked his path while another tackled him to the ground, the impact reverberating through the train car. The man struggled, thrashing and cursing as they pinned him down. The security guards stepped in to help, their combined strength overpowering him. Within moments, his hands were secured behind his back, the cold bite of handcuffs silencing his resistance. Passengers who had been oblivious just minutes earlier were now wide awake, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. Murmurs rippled through the car as people speculated about what had just happened. Clara barely heard them. Her focus was on Marina, whose frail body was trembling against her own. The young woman's face was pale, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. Clara could feel the fear radiating off her, and it broke her heart. One of the officers approached them, his expression softening as he took in their shaken state. "Are you both okay?" he asked, his voice calm and reassuring. Clara nodded, though her voice caught in her throat when she tried to speak. Marina, however, didn't respond. She seemed paralyzed, her gaze fixed on the floor as if afraid to look up. Clara gently squeezed her hand, trying to offer some comfort. She's scared," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wouldn't let her go. I think he was trying to take her." The officer nodded grimly. "We'll get her somewhere safe," he said. "But first we need to know what happened." Clara hesitated, glancing at Marina. The young woman's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Her hands trembled in Clara's grasp, and Clara realized she would have to be the one to explain, at least for now. "I noticed them on the train," Clara began, her voice steadier now. She looked scared. He was holding her arm really tightly, and he kept whispering to her. Then she made a signal, a hand gesture. "It's a distress signal, right?" That's when I knew something was wrong. The officer's brows furrowed, his expression growing more serious. "You did the right thing by calling us," he said. That signal saved her. Clara nodded, though the weight of everything that had just happened was starting to hit her. Her hands felt clammy, and her legs were weak. She wanted to sit down, to breathe, but Marina needed her. She couldn't leave her alone. Not yet. The other officer approached, dragging the now handcuffed man toward the end of the car. The man glared at Clara as he passed, his eyes filled with venom. "You don't know what you've done," he spat, his voice low and threatening. "You'll regret this." Clara flinched but didn't look away. She held his gaze, her jaw tightening as she stood her ground. She wasn't going to let him scare her, not anymore. "Take him to the station," the first officer instructed his partner. "We'll interrogate him there." As the man was led off the train, the tension in the car began to dissipate. The passengers returned to their seats, though many of them still cast curious glances at Clara and Marina. Clara ignored them, her attention solely on the young woman beside her. "Marina," Clara said softly, testing the name she had overheard during the chaos. "That's your name, right?" Marina finally looked up, her eyes meeting Clara's for the first time. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, a rawness that made Clara's throat tighten. She nodded slowly, her voice trembling as she whispered, Yes. You're safe now," Clara assured her, squeezing her hand gently. "He can't hurt you anymore." Marina's lips quivered, and for a moment, Clara thought she might start crying. But instead, she took a deep, shaky breath and nodded again. "Thank you," she whispered. You saved me." Clara shook her head. "I just did what anyone should do," she said. "But can you tell me what happened? Why was he—" Marina's face crumpled and she buried her face in her hands. Clara immediately regretted asking, but before she could apologize, Marina began to speak, her voice muffled but audible. He followed me," she said, her words broken by soft sobs. "I was leaving work and he came out of nowhere. Said I had to go with him, or he'd hurt me. He grabbed me, and I didn't know what to do. I thought no one would help me." Clara's heart ached as she listened. She couldn't imagine the terror Marina must have felt being dragged onto the train by that man, surrounded by strangers who didn't notice or didn't care. The thought made Clara's blood boil. How many people had seen them and looked the other way? How many had ignored the signs? "Well, I noticed," Clara said firmly, "and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again. You're safe now, I promise." Marina looked up at her, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, a tiny spark that made Clara's chest swell with relief. Marina wasn't broken. She was scared, yes, but she was still standing, and that was enough. The train was quiet now. The tension that had gripped the car moments ago seemed to dissipate, replaced by a heavy, lingering silence. The officers had taken the man away, and Marina was being escorted to safety by a security guard who promised to stay with her until she could contact her family. Clara watched as they disappeared through the train doors, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and exhaustion. She sat down on one of the empty seats, her body sinking into it as the adrenaline finally began to wear off. Her hands still trembled, her heart still raced. But the danger was over. Marina was safe. That thought alone allowed her to take her first deep breath since this had all begun. One of the officers approached her, his expression kind but serious. He was tall, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent dealing with the city's darkest corners. "Miss," he said, his voice gentle, "do you have a moment to talk before we let you go?" Clara nodded, though her throat felt dry. "Of course," she said, her voice hoarse. The officer sat across from her, pulling out a small notebook. "First, I want to say you did an incredible thing tonight. Most people wouldn't have noticed what you did, let alone acted on it. You probably saved that girl's life." Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired. "I just did what anyone should do," she said quietly. "I couldn't just sit there and do nothing." The officer smiled faintly, his pen scratching against the page as he jotted something down. "Not everyone would have been so observant or brave," he said. "What you did took guts." Clara didn't respond. She didn't feel brave. She had been terrified the entire time, her mind filled with worst-case scenarios and the overwhelming fear that she might fail. But she supposed bravery wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about acting despite it. "Do you know who he was?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man, I mean." The officer's expression darkened. "We're still running his information, but from what we've seen so far, he's bad news. He has a record, assault, kidnapping, the works. He's been on our radar for a while, but we've never been able to catch him in the act. Until tonight." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had known the man was dangerous, but hearing it confirmed made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "So he's done this before?" she asked. The officer nodded grimly. "More than once, we suspect. But thanks to you, we've got him now. And Marina. She's safe. That's what matters." Clara nodded slowly, the weight of the officer's words settling over her. She still couldn't believe how quickly everything had happened. One moment she had been a tired student just trying to get home. The next she had been thrust into a situation that could have gone horribly wrong. But it hadn't. She had acted, and because of that, Marina was safe. The officer closed his notebook, slipping it back into his pocket. "You'll probably need to give an official statement later," he said, rising to his feet. "But for now, you should get some rest. You've done more than enough tonight." Clara nodded, offering him a faint smile. "Thank you," she said. The officer tipped his hat slightly before stepping off the train, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. She leaned back against the seat, staring out the window at the darkened city as the train began to move again. The lights of Chicago blurred together, a kaleidoscope of colors against the inky blackness of the night. Clara thought about Marina, about the fear in her eyes and the courage it must have taken to make that signal. She thought about the other passengers, the ones who hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared. And she thought about herself, about the moment she had decided to stand up and do something, even though every instinct had screamed at her to stay silent. She had always thought of herself as a quiet observer, someone who stayed in the background and avoided drawing attention. But tonight she had learned something about herself, something that both terrified and inspired her. She wasn't just an observer. She was capable of action, of courage, of making a difference. As the train rattled on toward her stop, Clara made a silent promise to herself. She would never ignore the signs again. She would stay vigilant, stay aware, and stay ready to act when it mattered most. Because in a city like Chicago, where danger lurked in every shadow, sometimes all it took was one person paying attention to change everything. And tonight, that person had been her.